the most baffling element of Tom Parker Bowles driving around London with Princess Diana's highly sensitive, private letters sitting in the trunk of his car isn't merely the shocking discovery itself. It's the laughably inadequate excuse he offered when confronted. If one is going to be caught red-handed with some of the most intimately protected, historically sensitive documents in modern British royal history, logic dictates having a bulletproof narrative prepared. However, when King Charles physically lifted that slightly ajar trunk lid in the Buckingham Palace courtyard and discovered numerous sealed folders glaringly marked Diana Confidential, the stuttering explanation that immediately followed was essentially, "Someone just gave them to me for a book project." A book project. Tom Parker Bowles is a professional food writer and restaurant critic. He writes eloquently about regional cheeses, the perfect roast chicken, and culinary history. The notion that highly classified government files and Diana's deeply personal, handwritten letters organically fell into his lap as research material for a culinary endeavor strains credulity beyond the breaking point. This absurdity is exactly where the narrative shifts from mere scandal to something far more deeply unsettling. To fully grasp the magnitude of this confrontation, the scene must be set accurately, as the context amplifies the bizarre nature of the event. This was not a quiet, random Tuesday evening at the palace. This occurred on the highly publicized night of a grand state banquet at Buckingham Palace, an event characterized by blazing golden lights, glittering chandeliers, visiting world leaders, powerful ambassadors, and A-list celebrities. It was the precise kind of intensely choreographed evening where absolutely every fork placement is meticulously planned months in advance, and every public smile is carefully rehearsed. Charles had finally ascended to the throne after waiting longer than any heir apparent in British history. And this specific banquet was designed to be his definitive moment to project unwavering strength and absolute stability under his new reign. Prince William and Catherine arrived looking characteristically immaculate, with Catherine wearing a deep emerald gown that captivated every camera flash. Charles and Camilla entered the grand hall hand in hand, her silver gown shimmering under the lights as the assembled crowd cheered politely. And then, Tom Parker Bowles smoothly pulled up in his sleek black car, wearing a sharp suit and sporting carefully combed hair, appearing as just another distinguished name on the exclusive guest list. Except to Prince William, Tom was absolutely never just another name on a list. He was the breathing, walking reminder that Camilla's extended family had successfully permanently woven itself into the very fabric of the ancient monarchy. The profound tension was immediately visible in the tightening of William's jaw the exact moment Tom stepped out of the vehicle, rigid, controlled, and intensely watchful. The lavish dinner itself proceeded through its formal motions, a string orchestra playing softly in the background, an endless, pristine table draped in white cloth and sparkling crystal glasses, accompanied by lofty toasts celebrating international unity, shared history, and the unbreakable bond between nations. Tom sat comfortably just a few seats away from King Charles, laughing easily and chatting amiably with senior government ministers about fine food, new restaurants, and civilian life outside the restrictive palace walls. While some high-ranking guests clearly found him charming, William decidedly did not. To the Prince of Wales, Tom's loud, easy laughter felt grossly out of place, a jarring sound that fundamentally did not belong echoing in the royal hall. Adding to the heavy atmosphere was the glaring absence of Prince Harry across the ocean. Harry had deliberately chosen a completely different life, deliberately distancing himself from palace dinners and forced, diplomatic smiles. His empty chair at the banquet table served as its own powerful, silent statement. Consequently, the entire night carried a dangerous undercurrent of simmering tension that the official cameras couldn't quite capture, perfectly polite on the polished surface, but violently boiling just underneath. As the grand banquet finally concluded and the distinguished guests began slowly filtering out into the cool London night, Charles quietly excused himself, murmuring to Camilla that he simply needed some fresh air. He walked alone through the vast palace corridors, his footsteps echoing sharply against the cold marble, and stepped outside into the crisp, quiet courtyard. Elite guards stood rigidly at their posts, completely silent and watchful. A long line of sleek black cars gleamed under the warm glow of the lanterns, and it was in that quiet moment that the king noticed Tom's car. The trunk wasn't fully securely shut, there was just a very small, almost invisible gap, but it was enough of an anomaly to immediately draw his trained eye. At Buckingham Palace, where security protocols are arguably tighter and more paranoid than anywhere else in Britain, absolutely nothing is ever accidentally left unsealed, and every single vehicle is routinely checked. So, the glaring question presented itself. Why exactly was Tom's trunk left open on palace grounds? Charles frowned, glancing around quickly to ensure no one was watching, stepped closer to the vehicle, hesitated for just a fraction of a second, and then decisively lifted the heavy trunk lid. Inside the compartment, poorly hidden beneath a dark, nondescript cloth, were massive stacks of official documents and heavily sealed envelopes tied securely with red string. They were visibly old, worn at the edges, and clearly marked with official stamps from high-level government offices. Sitting prominently right on top of the pile, almost as if it had been deliberately placed there to be easily seen by anyone looking, was a single thick folder with bold, unmistakable letters stamped across it. Diana Confidential. Charles physically staggered back from the car, his face instantly draining of color and going completely pale as his breath caught in his throat. He didn't even have a moment to fully process the catastrophic nature of what he was looking at before a sharp voice sliced cleanly through the heavy silence behind him. "William? Father, what are you doing?" And then William's sharp eyes moved swiftly past Charles's frozen figure to the open trunk, and the sudden shift in his facial expression was instantaneous. It registered as profound shock first, followed immediately by something infinitely sharper and more dangerous, absolute, unadulterated fury. This brings us to the core, glaring contradiction that causes Tom's entire defensive narrative to completely unravel under basic scrutiny. Tom's primary explanation was that he absolutely didn't steal anything. He claimed that someone else had simply given him the highly classified files. He alleged that a man he had previously worked with, someone who purportedly deals in the lucrative market of rare, historical documents, had approached him, claiming he possessed explosive information about Diana, and asserting that wealthy collectors or tabloids would eagerly pay millions of pounds for it. Tom claimed he initially didn't believe the man, but when he was actually shown the physical documents, he hastily took possession of them merely to keep them safe. Safe? Sitting loosely in the trunk of his car during a highly publicized state banquet at Buckingham Palace, where absolutely anyone, security, staff, or guests, could have easily found them. That is fundamentally not safekeeping. That is not even a competent attempt at hiding them. That is the equivalent of casually carrying around explosive radioactive material in the absolute one place on Earth where its discovery would cause the maximum possible institutional damage. If Tom had genuinely honestly wanted to protect Diana's fragile legacy and ensure these sensitive documents remained out of the wrong, exploitative hands, why on earth would he actively bring them onto the grounds of Buckingham Palace? Why wouldn't he immediately lock them securely in a private bank vault or a home safe? Why wouldn't he instantly and discreetly notify King Charles or elite palace security about the breach? The internal logic of his entire explanation completely and utterly falls apart the precise moment you apply even the slightest bit of critical pressure to it. And William aggressively applied that pressure. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the open trunk, his voice trembling with unrestrained rage, and fiercely demanded that Tom explain exactly why his late mother's deeply personal letters, classified government reports, and secret sealed files were casually sitting in the trunk of Camilla's son's car. "Don't lie to me," the Prince of Wales demanded. "These are private, highly sensitive files about my mother." "Exactly where did you get them?" Tom's stuttering response that he was supposedly told they were useful for a vague book project only escalated the situation. A book project? William's absolute disbelief was palpable in the cold air. "You genuinely expect us to believe this? That Diana's most intimate, personal letters were randomly handed to you for research on a cookbook? That single, incredulous line perfectly encapsulates exactly how utterly absurd this pivotal moment truly was. Tom is a well-known food critic. His entire professional identity and career are solidly built around reviewing restaurants and discussing recipes. The preposterous idea that a shadow broker approached him with highly classified royal documents, specifically for a culinary literary project, doesn't merely stretch credibility, it completely ignores the basic reality of how the black market for information operates. Highly sensitive, stolen royal documents do not simply float around the rare manuscript market waiting for opportunistic food writers to scoop them up. If a broker actually possessed Diana's confidential letters, they would go directly to the highest bidding tabloid press, or they would approach a massive publisher with a proven track record in explosive royal biographies. They would seek out someone who could easily and quietly pay the millions Tom himself mentioned. They would absolutely not hand them over to the Queen Consort's son and say, "Here, you should use these for your next book about making pasta." Charles desperately tried to mediate the explosive confrontation, but it was agonizingly clear he was being violently torn in two completely different directions. On one side stood his eldest son, the future king, his voice filled with entirely rightful, undeniable anger over the violation of his mother's privacy. On the other side was his wife Camilla, the woman he had aggressively fought the entire world for decades to protect, and her biological son, who was now inextricably tied to a dark secret that could literally bring absolute ruin to the crown. When Charles slowly, hesitantly reached into the trunk, pulled out a single envelope, and opened it with visibly trembling hands, he found a delicate letter written entirely in Diana's highly familiar, elegant, and unmistakable handwriting. These were absolutely not just dry, bureaucratic government records. These were raw fragments of Diana's most private thoughts, penned during some of her darkest, most isolated days inside the firm. The king's hand shook so violently he could barely continue reading the words. William watched all of this unfold, his deep fury building exponentially with every single second his father appeared to hesitate. "This ends tonight," William stated with absolute finality. "Either we confront him and deal with this tonight, or I absolutely will do it myself. But one thing is absolutely clear, Father, if you choose to protect him, if you protect him again over me, you will lose me forever." That was absolutely not a threat made lightly in the heat of the moment. That was the direct heir to the British throne firmly drawing a hard line in the palace marble, explicitly telling the reigning king exactly what the devastating, ultimate cost of his continued blind loyalty to Camilla's family would be. The rapid timeline of these events is crucial because it demonstrates exactly how fast this crisis escalated from a tense, private discovery in a courtyard to a massive global public explosion. That intense confrontation happened very late at night, long after the banquet had ended. By the early hours of dawn, the catastrophic news had already reached Camilla. A single, terrifying message was whispered urgently through the palace halls. "The trunk has been opened." She sat bolt upright in bed, the luxurious silk sheets falling around her, and immediately knew exactly what that cryptic phrase meant. Her trusted aide quickly confirmed her worst fears. William knew everything. He had physically seen the letters, and her own son Tom was the one who had been caught red-handed with them on palace grounds. Camilla's immediate reaction was one of pure, unadulterated panic. She tightly clutched the edge of the heavy bed, her rings digging painfully into her skin, and whispered in horror, "Diana's letters in Tom's car." This was the manifestation of her absolute greatest, most paralyzing nightmare coming true. Diana's long shadow, the inescapable ghost that had relentlessly haunted her entire decades-long relationship with Charles, had violently risen again in the absolute most dangerous, destructive way possible. And William, the deeply grieving boy who had once glared at her with silent, burning hatred, now possessed tangible, undeniable proof to rightfully fuel his anger against her family. She rushed frantically through the quiet palace corridors, her soft slippers brushing loudly against the cold stone, feeling as though every single historical portrait on the wall was watching her panic with harsh, judgmental eyes. When she finally reached the courtyard and saw Charles standing silently by the car looking visibly years older, gray with despair, and Tom lingering nearby, silent and deeply ashamed, she completely fell apart. "You absolute fool," she hissed at her son. "Do you have any idea what you've done? You've completely destroyed everything we built. You violently ripped open deep wounds that absolutely never fully healed. You've essentially handed William the exact weapon he has absolutely always wanted to use against us." Tom desperately tried to explain his absurd reasoning again, insisting that he absolutely hadn't stolen the documents, that he was merely keeping them safe from the press, but Camilla's furious response cut viciously through all his weak excuses. "Safe? You genuinely call this safe? Locked in a car trunk on palace grounds waiting to be discovered by the king? Safe from exactly whom, Tom? From William? From the king? From me? And honestly, that is the exact lingering question that still does not possess a satisfying logical answer. Safe from whom? If the ultimate goal was truly to fiercely protect these highly sensitive documents from being exploited by the media, actively bringing them onto highly secure palace grounds was undeniably the single worst, most idiotic decision possible. If the ultimate goal was to eventually strategically reveal them to the world, then poorly hiding them in a car trunk doesn't make any logical sense either. If the ultimate goal was to quietly sell them to the highest bidder, the timing and location of the possession are entirely bizarre and amateurish. Absolutely none of the possible explanations line up smoothly with the physical actions taken. That is exactly what makes this entire incident feel significantly less like an unfortunate, bumbling accident and infinitely more like something that was deliberately waiting to be found. Camilla collapsed heavily onto a cold stone bench, racking sobs tearing through her chest, her entire body shaking with fear. She turned desperately to Charles, her voice raw, panicked and pleading. "He will hate me forever for this, Charles. He always deeply hated me, but now he actually has a valid reason. He'll happily tell the entire world that I destroyed his mother's legacy. He'll turn the British people against me completely. The crown will slip permanently from my head before it's even fully secure." And then she uttered the devastating words that reportedly chilled King Charles to the very bone. "Diana has won. Even in death she has finally won." That specific, agonizing line tells you exactly where Camilla's head was truly at during this crisis. This wasn't merely about the stolen documents or the breach of security anymore. This was fundamentally about a bitter, decades-long psychological competition. She deeply felt she could absolutely never win, a powerful ghost she could never successfully outrun, and the crushing realization that her own son's foolish actions had just effortlessly handed that very ghost the ultimate victory she had absolutely always feared. Meanwhile, William was absolutely not done. He had physically left the courtyard, but the emotional storm raging violently inside him was far from over. He had firmly told his father, "Tomorrow morning I will tell Catherine absolutely everything, and if Camilla somehow doesn't know yet, she absolutely will. You cannot quietly bury this, father. You absolutely cannot protect him, not this time." And then, in what quickly became the defining turning point of the entire historic crisis, William made the unprecedented decision to go entirely public with the betrayal. For 2 agonizing days, the desperate palace communications team tried everything to contain the leaks. Aggressive reporters crowded every single corner of the estate. Microphones raised high, shouted questions cutting sharply through the tense air. Is Prince William actively fighting with the king? Did Camilla's son really steal Princess Diana's private letters? Fallen into yet another massive scandal? The paralyzed palace issued absolutely no official statement. Silence was originally meant to protect the institution, but that silence quickly became the absolute loudest, most damning answer of all. And then, Prince William stepped resolutely out of Kensington Palace with Catherine standing firmly at his side, and he forcefully broke the wall of silence. Normally, William waves politely to the press, says a few careful diplomatic words, and quickly retreats behind closed doors. Not this time. His eyes were icy cold, his shoulders incredibly stiff, his jaw firmly locked in pure fury. He raised his hand demanding absolute silence, and shockingly, the ravenous press completely obeyed the future king. His voice was perfectly steady, but it carried undeniable fire. I will absolutely not speak long today, but I will absolutely speak the truth. My mother's memory deeply deserves it. The assembled reporters leaned forward collectively. Recently, I shockingly discovered deeply personal belongings of my late mother, Princess Diana, hidden away in a place they absolutely should never have been. These were her highly private letters, her deepest private fears, her private heart. They were absolutely not respected by those who held them. They were absolutely not safe. Huge gasps physically rippled through the gathered crowd. Catherine lowered her eyes respectfully, her hands tightly clasped together in support. William continued, his voice noticeably sharpening with anger. I will absolutely not go into the specific details today, but I deeply want the entire world to know this one fact. My mother's dignity will absolutely not be silenced. Not by this palace, and absolutely not by anyone else. And then he abruptly turned away, flatly refusing to say a single word more or answer any shouted questions. Catherine gently placed her hand on his arm, quietly guiding him back inside the palace. The immense, undeniable damage was already done. Within a single hour, absolutely every major news station in Britain, and then rapidly across the entire world, flashed with identical screaming headlines. Prince William breaks silence on stolen Diana letters. Inside the walls of Buckingham Palace, absolute chaos instantly exploded. Highly paid advisors shouted frantically across large mahogany tables, secure phones rang endlessly off the hook, and official statements were desperately drafted and redrafted, though absolutely none were strong enough to stop the massive PR wildfire spreading outside the gates. Charles sat in complete defeated silence in his office, his face pale and drawn, his hands pressed tightly together. Every single word from William's mouth cut him deeper than a knife. He had desperately, privately begged his son to keep the ugly matter quiet and handle it internally. William had deliberately chosen to inform the world instead, and here's exactly where the much broader historical pattern becomes painfully clear to any observer. This crisis wasn't merely about one open trunk or one disastrous night at a banquet. This was the catastrophic explosion of long years of unresolved grief, deeply unspoken anger, and a highly fragile family structure that had desperately papered over its massive foundational cracks with polite, forced smiles and heavily rehearsed photographs. William had spent his entire highly scrutinized adult life flawlessly playing the exhausting role of the highly disciplined, dutiful heir. He smiled obediently in front of the flashing cameras. He pretended absolutely everything was perfectly fine for the sake of the crown. He stood stoically beside Camilla at countless state events and absolutely never publicly acknowledged the immense, lingering pain her continued presence caused him. But that specific trunk, those specific stolen letters, seeing Diana's unmistakable handwriting treated like contraband, it finally broke something fundamental inside him. It forced him to finally say out loud what he had only ever expressed in polite silence. All my life I've had to falsely pretend this family was whole, but it absolutely wasn't. It was fundamentally broken the exact moment you chose her over my mother. That is exactly what he had coldly told Charles in the courtyard that night. That is the deep, festering wound that has been rotting for decades. The open trunk simply ripped the protective bandage off violently and publicly. The public reaction to William's statement was immediate, overwhelming, and incredibly fierce. Massive crowds rapidly gathered outside the palace gates, holding up iconic pictures of Diana. They chanted her name loudly, almost as if she had miraculously returned from the grave to bravely stand against the monarchy once more. Social media platforms instantly flooded with beautiful images of her, clips of her old, revealing interviews, and her famous, enduring lines about simply wanting to be the queen of people's hearts. For many ordinary citizens, it felt as though she had powerfully risen again, her unyielding spirit carried forward in the righteous fury of her eldest son. American television networks replayed William's stark statement endlessly on absolutely every channel. Seasoned commentators fiercely debated whether this unprecedented breach was the actual beginning of the monarchy's ultimate collapse. Major newspapers prominently carried split photos on their front pages. On one side, a radiant, smiling Diana; on the other, a tear-streaked, panicked Camilla. The brutal headlines essentially wrote themselves, and the British people immediately and decisively chose sides. The vast majority stood firmly with William. A small minority defended Charles. Very, very few stood with Camilla or her son. Charles, facing the absolute greatest, most perilous crisis of his short reign so far, made a highly desperate, unprecedented gamble. He decided he had to address the angry nation directly. His senior advisor strongly warned against it, arguing it was entirely too dangerous to officially admit there were stolen letters, and far too dangerous to formally confirm that William spoke the truth. But Charles aggressively cut through all their warnings. "No more lies," he stated firmly. "If we hide behind these walls, we fall. If we stay silent, we burn. The people absolutely must hear directly from me. Not tomorrow, not next week, today." Camilla tearfully begged him not to do it. "If you speak publicly of her, you will permanently bury me. Every single word you say will officially place Diana above me, even in death, and the British people will absolutely never forgive me." Charles looked at his wife with incredibly tired, defeated eyes and said quietly, "Tonight, I am absolutely not speaking as a king. Tonight, I am only speaking as a father, a deeply broken father." His televised speech was relatively short, but every single word he spoke carved deep into the national consciousness. He stood alone in the grand throne room, the camera lights blazing, and spoke not with the detachment of a monarch, but with the raw vulnerability of a man. He openly admitted that Diana's deeply personal letters had indeed been shockingly found in a place they absolutely should never have been. He admitted that this massive breach had caused incredibly deep, lasting hurt to his family, and most of all to William. He clearly stated that Diana was the beloved mother of his children, that she would absolutely always be honored, always be warmly remembered, and always be deeply respected by the institution. And then, he said the exact words that completely stunned the watching nation: "Any failure to protect her sacred memory is my heavy burden, and mine alone to bear. I ask the nation for patience, I ask for healing, and I ask for my son to somehow forgive me." The public reaction to the speech was instant and polarized. Crowds across Britain cheered his unprecedented honesty and vulnerability. For the very first time, many felt that Charles had finally spoken with his genuine heart, rather than reading rehearsed, sterile PR words drafted by committees. But others in the crowd turned their tears into louder chants for Diana, raising her name higher as if she were still alive and fighting. The press largely praised his immense courage in facing the scandal, but immediately began asking incredibly dangerous, existential questions. If King Charles openly admits massive failure in his household, is Camilla truly fit to remain queen? If Prince William is the sole fierce defender of Diana's memory and the public's trust, should he perhaps take the throne and lead the country sooner than expected? Inside the palace, Camilla collapsed in uncontrollable tears. She felt entirely stripped bare before the judgmental world, her hard-won crown slipping away like sand through her trembling fingers. Tom cursed bitterly under his breath, fully knowing the intense global blame for the open trunk would absolutely never leave him. And William sat quietly in his study with Catherine and listened to his father's historic words in complete silence. When the broadcast ended, he absolutely didn't cheer. He didn't curse in anger. He only whispered softly. At last, he finally spoke the truth. Catherine gently touched his hand and asked softly, "So, will you forgive him?" William stared blankly at the dark night beyond the window glass. His jaw was still tight, his eyes still fierce with unresolved pain. "I honestly don't know," he said. "The truth has finally been spoken out loud, but truth alone absolutely does not heal decades of damage. And that is exactly where the story truly lands. It doesn't land on the initial, shocking discovery, it doesn't land on the screaming confrontation in the courtyard, and it doesn't even land on the massive public explosion. It lands heavily on the undeniable fact that a family entirely built on suffocating silence and ruthless image management finally had its impenetrable walls broken down by a car trunk that simply wasn't fully shut. Tom Parker Bowles may or may not have possessed completely innocent intentions. Maybe a shadow broker really did give him those highly classified documents. Maybe he truly foolishly did think he was simply keeping them safe in his car. But the exact way it all publicly played out, the open trunk, the glittering palace banquet, the suspicious timing, the laughable book project excuse, absolutely none of it adds up to a clean, innocent explanation. What it definitively adds up to is a deeply fractured family that has absolutely never properly or healthily, with its immense grief, its crushing guilt, or its lingering ghosts. Diana's private letters were physically archives, but her powerful memory was absolutely never really buried by the public or her children. It was always just waiting for someone foolish enough to lift the lid. Catherine, quietly watching all of this chaos unfold, wrote poignantly in her private journal that night, "I deeply love my husband, but I truly fear for him now." On one side stood his eldest son, the future king, his voice filled with entirely rightful, undeniable anger over the violation of his mother's privacy. On the other side was his wife Camilla, the woman he had aggressively fought the entire world for decades to protect, and her biological son, who was now inextricably tied to a dark secret that could literally bring absolute ruin to the crown. When Charles slowly, hesitantly reached into the trunk, pulled out a single envelope, and opened it with visibly trembling hands, he found a delicate letter written entirely in Diana's highly familiar, elegant, and unmistakable handwriting. These were absolutely not just dry, bureaucratic government records. These were raw fragments of Diana's most private thoughts, penned during some of her darkest, most isolated days inside the firm. The king's hand shook so violently he could barely continue reading the words. William watched all of this unfold, his deep fury building exponentially with every single second his father appeared to hesitate. "This ends tonight," William stated with absolute finality. "Either we confront him and deal with this tonight, or I absolutely will do it myself. But one thing is absolutely clear, Father, if you choose to protect him, if you protect him again over me, you will lose me forever." That was absolutely not a threat made lightly in the heat of the moment. That was the direct heir to the British throne firmly drawing a hard line in the palace marble, explicitly telling the reigning king exactly what the devastating, ultimate cost of his continued blind loyalty to Camilla's family would be. The rapid timeline of these events is crucial because it demonstrates exactly how fast this crisis escalated from a tense, private discovery in a courtyard to a massive global public explosion.